a real blessing that we have as God's people to be able to come together and to encourage one another. And it's a different and awkward situation at times, but I feel like each service gets a little bit better as we figure out how to do this, and I find each of them more encouraging than the one before. And believe me, it's just great to be able to see all of you and to know that all of you at home are joining in as well. You know, people, when you see something in another person that you sometimes can't exactly put a finger on it, but there's something about them that you don't like, a lot of times as time goes by, you'll come to the realization, well, I think what it is that they seem to be disingenuous. They seem to be a little bit fake. And whenever we detect that sort of hypocrisy in another person, it really turns us off on them. And that's especially the case when it comes to people in regards to their religious practice. If we come to view someone as insincere or as putting on a show when it comes to their religious practice, or their religiosity might be a way to describe it, as religious hypocrisy, it really turns us off, it turns us away. And many people actually claim that that's the reason that they have gotten away from religion, and Christianity in particular, is because of what they perceive to be the hypocrisy in other people. The remarkable thing about that to me is that Jesus says the same thing. He tells us here in Matthew, the 6th chapter, and in verses 5 through 9, really the whole chapter, that God has the same view about hypocrisy. In the first part of this chapter, he talks about people being hypocritical in the way that they do their good works or their charitable deeds, doing those in order for people to say good things about them and say what a fine, upstanding individual that is. Or in the latter part of the chapter, he talks about people who fast in order that people might see their spiritual discipline and highly esteem them for that reason. And sandwiched between these two things, he speaks about prayer and how some people's prayers, particularly their public prayers, are not so much directed toward God as they are at people. Now, ostensibly, it's directed toward God, but it's actually done as a piece of performance art for those who are listening in. And Jesus tells us that when God sees that, he is just as turned off by it as people who pick up on that problem are. In fact, it just affirms something that the Bible actually tells us from the Old Testament all the way through the New, and that is that there's a tendency for men to look on the outward thing, for men to look on that which is surface, and God tends to look upon the heart. He sees into the innermost part of the being, and that's what he's looking for, a genuineness of heart, not a performance on the outside. And so when we come to this, we're going to see that as Jesus talks to us about prayer, the first thing that he does is describe it, at least our private prayer, a certain kind of prayer that we need to pursue, as us pursuing or meeting the Father in the secret place. Meeting the Father in the secret place. That is so much about what prayer really is all about. And we see that Jesus describes this beginning in verse 5 this way. He says, and when you pray, now just stop there for a moment. It is the Lord's assumption that you as his disciple, as someone who follows after Christ, will be a person who prays. And I hope that if prayerlessness has been characteristic of your life up till this point, that something in this message will resonate with you such that you'll become a more prayerful person. There's something sad, there's something missing, there's something shallow and powerless in the life of a person who does not have regular communion with God. And Jesus is the one who makes it possible for us to draw near to God, to come to him in confidence, and take a life that has been cut off from communication with God, that's been cut off from heaven, and bring those two together. It's one of the blessings that the gospel brings to those who obey it, who come to Christ in faith, is that he enables us to open our hearts to the Father and to have that communication with him that we so desperately need. And so Jesus opens this discussion of prayer by assuming that his disciples will have followed him in this way and have become a people characterized by prayer. So when you pray, he then tells us what not to do. He says, don't pray like the hypocrites. Hypocrites are people, this word hypocrisy was a word common in the Greek and then Roman culture. And it was used to describe first people who worked as actors at the theater. So they didn't have movies like we did. They went to live plays, and the actors were generally not one actor playing one role, but one actor would play several different roles. And in order for the audience to be able to keep the scorecard of who's who, the actor would have a mask, a multiple mask. And depending on which role he was playing, he would put that mask before his face. And then when he switched to the other role, he would put the other mask before his face. And he was called a hypocrite. And that wasn't meant to be a negative thing, obviously, about them, but it came to be something to describe a person who play acts, who appears to be one thing and then another. Given one set of circumstances, he behaves, thinks, and speaks this way, but around a different crowd of people or a different circumstance, he conducts himself differently. And that's defined as hypocrisy. And when it comes to the practice of our religion, where we appear to be doing one thing when in reality we're doing something else, is one of the most condemned things in the Bible. Certainly, Jesus talks extensively about those who do their religious doings to be seen by people. In other words, they pretend that they're addressing themselves to God, but in reality, they're just putting on for men. And Jesus says, when you pray, do not allow your prayers to become hypocritical, but let them be real. Let them be genuine. Isn't that what we want to see in others? People who are authentic, people who are sincere, people who mean what they say from the heart. When we find a person that's like that, we're just drawn to that naturally, even if they don't have a lot of charisma or talents otherwise. If they're just real, we just appreciate that and we love that about other people. But again, when we begin to detect a hypocrisy, an insincerity in a person's life, or that there is a disagreement between what they promote themselves to be publicly and in regards to their religion and what they are actually on the inside, it's something that's disgusting, or should be to us, both from the human point of view and certainly is from God's. But he says that we should not be like that in our prayers. Don't be like the hypocrites. And here's what they do. They love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners in order to be seen by men. This is what they want. And isn't it true that so much of human activity is driven by the desire to be seen by others in a good light? We want others to think well of us. We want others to speak well of us. And one of the ways that we can, perhaps all of us, identify with that in our common modern time is with our social media. We love it when people look at our Facebook page or when they like our Instagram feed or whatever all of those things are. If we get retweeted, if people are drawn to that, if people think well of the face that we're presenting to the world, whether it reflects the reality or not, there's sort of an adrenaline rush. There's something that goes off inside of us that sort of lights us up when that happens. And in doing so, we reflect that our primary audience, our primary concern is the approval of other people. And that in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. We should be mindful of our reputation and try to guard those kinds of things. But it certainly should be something that is a value nested within a hierarchy of greater values, with the greatest value of all being the opinion that God has of us. That when God looks upon us, He looks upon us with favor, and that He likes what it is that we say and do. And that should be the priority for us, far and away above the approval of one another. And so Jesus says, don't be like the hypocrites who pray or conduct their religious affairs in such a way as to gain the applause and the approval of men. But rather we're looking for the applause of heaven, the approval of our Father there. And so he says in verse 5, the latter part of the verse, about those who pray in this hypocritical way, truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. They have received their reward in full. Now, what that means is that there is something about receiving the praise of men. When you pray a great prayer and everybody loves that and thinks that you're really Mr. Great Spirituality because of the eloquence with which you talk to God, and they praise you for that and they think highly of you because of it, and your status gets elevated in the church or within some social group because of that. There's something to that. There's some benefit that is associated with that. But Jesus says that is all the benefit that is associated with it. And in the end, isn't it true that all the likes in the world eventually become a hollow and empty thing? Isn't it true that it's, at the end of the day, not enough? That there's something in the human heart that craves the approval of something greater than the sum total of our peers or even all of humanity. If we gain the world's approval, but we do so at the cost of our own soul, our own integrity, our own sincerity, we've made a terrible trade. And so Jesus says, don't be satisfied with the approval of men. Seek rather the approval of God, so that your reward will not be limited by the limited passing praise of men, but by the abiding and eternal and great approval of God. And then he goes on and says to us positively, when you pray, so don't pray like the hypocrites to be seen by men, but rather when you pray, pray this way. When you go into your room, the King James says into your closet. The idea is some private space. And there he says to close the door. Now, the first thing that may come to our mind is, well, I thought we could pray anywhere. And we can. I mean, Jesus, as we read a moment ago in Luke chapter 6, went into a mountain to pray. And often we're told that he would get up early in the morning and go into some secluded or wilderness place to pray. I prefer just going to my room or my closet and closing the door to pray. But the point isn't here the specific location as it is the privacy and the seclusion that the person is seeking, because what they're after is intimacy with God and not the publicity of men. And so Jesus says, when you pray, go to your room. Now, you can pray in other places, and you can pray in public and before your meals, and that's certainly fine. In church, we're told that we are to pray as the assembled people of God, and so he's not saying never do that. And you can pray when you drive down Scottsville Road eating your hamburger and talking on the phone and trimming your toenails, or you can pray on your way to school. Please don't let there be a quiz today. Please don't let there be a quiz today. Or you can be driving home after your curfew and be saying, Lord, please let my parents not be awake. Please don't let them be awake. You can pray those kinds of prayers if you want. But Jesus is saying to us here, there's something else about prayer. There's a kind of prayer that maybe if those are the only sorts of prayers that you offer, that you're missing out on, that I want you as my disciples to get in on. And it's a prayer that happens not in a desperate situation when you're just crying out for deliverance or help, though that's fine. And it's not just prayers that are offered up in public places or with your family before meals, but there's a prayer that takes place behind closed doors, when there's no one else around, when it's only you and God, and Jesus is inviting us to follow him into those secret places where we can seek the Father's heart. It's a place then that is planned. We decide ahead of time that I'm going to do this, and so we make provision for it. It's a place in which we're alone, and it's a place in which we are unrushed. Part of the problem with our hectic schedules that most of us live with in this day and time is that we're constantly hurrying from one thing to the next. And it's a problem for me because I have difficulty with my squirrel brain ever settling down and just being totally in the moment that I'm in. I'm always, while I'm doing this, thinking about what's got to happen next, and it's really difficult. But Jesus is inviting us to this place of unhurried, unpublic, unrushed intimacy with God, where no one is going to give you credit and no one is going to give you grief over what takes place there. And he says next in the last part of verse 6, that when you're in that secret place, then you should pray to your Father who is unseen. Then he who sees what is done in secret will reward you, and some translations say openly, but some people might read this statement here and say, well, okay, I see how it works. If you go into the closet or your room and you close the door, that's how you get the Father to reward you. And I want the reward. I want the blessings. I want the good things that are on my request list. And so that means if it requires me to go into my room, then hey, as soon as this service is over, I'm out of here. I'm going home. I'm going to get in my closet. I'm going to close the door because I've got a long list of things I've been asking for that I haven't been getting, and I'm wanting them. And the problem is, you see, I've been doing it in the kitchen. I've been praying in the car, and I see that Jesus is saying, no, the secret to effective prayer is to do it in your room or in your closet with the door closed. Well, obviously, no. That's not what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about a reward that the Father will give us when we seek Him in the secret place that doesn't have to do with a list of things that He gives us as the giver of gifts, but something else much better that we're going to talk about in just a moment. But one of the wonderful things about seeking the Father in the secret place is that immediately when you close that door behind you, the pressure is off. Think about that. Do you ever get tired of just the pressure? The pressure that comes from being in the public eye, being seen by other people. And you just need to be yourself. And what God is inviting us to do in the secret place is come before Him with no one else watching, so that you and the one with whom you have to do, the one who knows everything about you, the one with whom there's no secrets, you can just relax reverently and yet open up and be there with Him. Because He's not moved by perfection. He's not moved by how well we play the role. He's moved by the contrition of heart, the humility and the reverence and the love that we show to Him in communion. And so Jesus says in verse 7 that when you pray, there's something else we need to avoid. And that is the babbling of the pagans. He says, don't keep on babbling like the pagans. Now, whenever we read the word pagan, we immediately tend to think of it as just sort of a pejorative term in which he's mocking or making fun of. And it's actually just means people who do not have a biblical understanding of who God is. People who do not have a knowledge of the revelation that God has made of Himself in Scripture, and specifically through Jesus Christ, so that we know His nature. In other words, people who don't know God as He is imagine God to be something other than what He is. And that's the pagan mindset. And so when you go and you read about the views that people who don't hold to a biblical concept of God, what view they have of deity, what view they have of God, it reveals something very different in its very nature than that which we see revealed in Scripture. And it's why people who don't know God think that if they come up with the perfect mantra that can be repeated over and over again, that this is the way to get the deity's attention. That if I can say the right words, the right way, the right number of times, then he'll listen to me. In fact, the word heard just has the concept of being taken seriously. If my many words, if my babbling, if my saying just the right phrases, the right number of times, then all of a sudden the deity will take me seriously and listen to me and give me the things that I want. Perhaps the classic illustration of this is found in the book of 1 Kings, where Elijah and the prophets of Baal sort of go head to head. And do you remember what the prophets of Baal, these pagans who didn't know God, did? They prayed and they prayed and they prayed. All day long they prayed, and when Baal did not answer them, they took out sacrificial knives and began to slash and cut their bodies till the blood gushed out. Because in their pagan way of thinking, in order to get God to take them seriously, they had to pray long, wordy prayers and do harmful things to themselves in order to get his attention. And when Jesus says, don't pray like the pagans, that's what he means, because the pagans don't know something that you and I should know, and that is that God is our Father, who already takes us seriously, and who already longs for us to be in his presence, and desires to give good and perfect gifts to his children. It makes all the difference in the world when we follow Jesus into the secret place and there learn to commune with the Father. But you know, there's not only this pagan view of God that leads people to pray in this way. You've probably heard it in Christian churches as well. Sometimes we think that there is a particular set of phrases that really lights God up, and the great prayers are the ones who know how to say those phrases with just the right voice inflection, that must be what really gets God's attention. In fact, I remember as a kid growing up, very young, there was an elder in the church in Amarillo who was the most eloquent prayer I've ever heard in my life. He was an extraordinarily talented person, recognized for his talents in the broader community as well as within the church, a gifted speaker. And when he prayed, it was just like, it was like taking hold of the gates of heaven, and you just felt like, the gates were just being shaken because, man, he could say the phrases and he could say it just right. And I remember as a child just thinking, wow, that's something. Until his wife finally divorced him for his repeated adulteries. God, again, he's not moved by the things that move us. We look on the outward things and we're impressed by various surface realities. But God, he's always looking in the heart. And he's not moved and he's not touched because of the things that we babble on about or the theological turn of phrase that we're gifted to turn, but because of who he is and because of who we're coming to him in the name of. And so he tells us in verse 8, don't be like them. Don't be like that. And here's why. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him. I just love that. Although for some here this morning, and some watching, it might be a rather baffling kind of thing to say. In fact, some of you may be thinking right now as you look at those words is, well, if I'm not praying to be heard of men, and I'm only supposed to be praying to God to be heard of him and seeking his approval, and he already knows everything that I need, and so I don't need to go on and on about telling him this laundry list of items that I want him to do for me, then what are we going to talk about? What do you pray about? And if you're thinking that way, what's the point? You are on the verge of a breakthrough this morning that has the potential to change not only the way that you pray, not just changing your prayer life, but changing your life. It's a change that is likened into that great poet, Dr. Seuss. I go in for the heavy artillery when it comes to my poetry. I actually am one of those people who like poetry that rhymes. And in Dr. Seuss's famous poem that we usually read as a family every year on Christmas Eve, the Grinch, after he had stolen all of the Who's gifts, and hauled them up Mount Crumpet and was about to toss them over the abyss, heard all the Who's down in Whoville assembling together and joining hand in hand and heart to heart to sing their song. And the Grinch, with his Grinch feet ice cold in the snow, stood puzzling. How could this be so? It came without ribbons. It came without tags. It came without packages, boxes, or bags. And so he puzzled until his puzzler was sore. Then the Grinch thought of something he hadn't before. What if Christmas, he thought, doesn't come from a store? What if Christmas perhaps means a little bit more? And when I say that some of you may be on the verge of a breakthrough in understanding prayer that can change your prayer life and change your whole life, is an understanding of prayer that is so much more than just coming to God with a list of items that you need to be delivered your way. But that prayer itself is actually entering into the secret place where the Father, who sees everything in secret, looks into your heart, and you open that heart to Him and you commune with the living God, where you are there face to face with your Father in heaven, coming to know Him and coming to know yourself as you reflect on who He is and who you are in His presence. That you're building an intimacy and a relationship that did not exist there before. It's so important that we come to think of prayer in this way, and not just as a way to get our wish list fulfilled. Over these past few months, there's been a lot of stresses and strains that you've gone through, and I've experienced plenty of them myself. And Janice and I, we're doing fine. I don't want to give anybody the wrong idea, but it seems to me that we've talked a lot, but it's always busy. We're talking about schedules. We're talking about the details of the hurly-burly of life, and this and then that, and it's been like difficult to connect in the way that we like to. I'm kind of excited right now. I'm not rushing this for this reason, but as soon as this service is over, she and I are going to get in the truck and we're going to head to Texas. We've got to go down to where her father's house was, and take care of a few things there, and then we're going to drive back tomorrow. It's going to be 20 hours in the car together. And I'm actually just really excited about that, because that provides an opportunity. We're going to have conversation. And we're going to have opportunity to reconnect in some ways that we've been neglecting because of the busyness of life. And you know what that's like, because you can be 3 feet away from a person and still just as disconnected as possible. But this sort of closeness that I'm looking forward to over the next couple of days is the kind of intimacy that reflects the intimacy that God desires with you as His child, who seeks the Father's face and His presence, again, not just as the giver of gifts, but for who He is in His very person. And that's the gift that we can discover when we follow Jesus into the secret place. What the breakthrough that many of you may discover as a consequence of thinking about this in a new light perhaps can be expressed exactly this way: that prayer may be more about experiencing the presence of God than receiving the presence of God. You know, as parents, How do you feel when your kids come to you only for stuff that they're needing? When they're just coming to you and saying, "Hey, Dad, can you spot me 100? Used to be 20, but that, inflation. Can you do this for me? Can you do that for me?" And as parents, we delight in giving good gifts to our children. That's fine. It's not that. But when that's all that it ever is, it can kind of get old. And when you're being played. So when a child comes, if your young child comes and wants to sit in your lap for a while, and an older child just wants to hang out together, well, that really gets you, doesn't it? That's what you want. That's the intimacy that you're desiring, and our Heavenly Father is no different. He loves to give good and wonderful blessings to His children, but the best blessing that God has to give us is Himself. When I look back on the life of my life and my experience with my father as his life is in its latter years and days, and I think about the greatest things I've received from him, the answer is it's not the things. It's not the things. It's getting to know him and the relationship and the memories and the character that he's helped me develop through those experiences shared together. And that's what God wants for each of us most of all, and it's something that can only be found when we come to him in the secret place and we open ourselves up before him. So as we conclude this morning, I want to leave you with just 3 quick takeaways from what Jesus has taught us here about how we can build intimacy with our Father. It takes 3 things. Number 1, it requires time. You and I are going to have to make the deliberate decision to go to the secret place, to find that prayer closet, to get into the room with the door closed where we're unhurried and unrushed. I've discovered for me, a lot of times it takes between 15 and 20 minutes for me to ever get in that headspace that I need to be in prayer, where I'm finally where I need to be and the communication with God really begins to take off. We need to slow down, because the most important thing in your life is not your finances, it's not your marriage, it's not your reputation, it's your intimate relationship with God, because everything else flows from that place. And if you're not focusing on maintaining and building that relationship, all of those other things are hanging on by a thread. And so let us devote the time to the thing that matters most and to the person who matters most. And it takes, secondly, a transparency. God's not moved by the words, by the eloquence, by the special theological terms that we've mastered. God is moved by the genuineness of a heart seeking Him. When you read the book of Psalms, that wonderful book of songs and prayers of godly people that God has inspired to speak back to Him, words that give voice to our own thoughts and feelings, what we discover more than anything else is the rawness, the genuineness, the sincerity that is inherent in those psalms. And they sometimes express anger and frustration with God, disappointment, sometimes even doubts. Those things surface and they find expression. They have a way of doing that while remaining reverent, and that is always to be the case. But we do not do ourselves any good when we come to God in prayer and then hide behind a mask, if you will. But we need to recognize that God already sees it. He already knows it. He knows what we're thinking, what we're feeling. He knows what we're doing. And what if we came to God and we actually talked to Him about the anger that we have, if not at Him, with other people, our frustrations that we're experiencing as we go through this crazy time that we're going through, the lust that you're battling in your heart. What if we just open these things up and address them directly with God? Here is what's going on in me and with me. And I need you, Father, to help me sort this out. That's what we find when we pursue Him in the secret place with the time we need, and the determination for transparency. The quality of your prayers is going to be determined more than anything else by your ability and your determination to be bone deep honest. And then finally, it takes trust. It takes a trust that we can open ourselves up to God, not be used or abused, and He won't. We're sometimes afraid that if I just open up and I put myself on the altar and I surrender myself entirely to God, there's no telling what He might do to me. And that's true. But I can tell you this, He won't do anything to you or require anything of you that will not ultimately be for your best and eternal good. He desires to give good gifts to His children. And even those things that He might take away or those things that He might require, even though it could be very painful, will always prove in the end to be beneficial. And when we look back on it, we will know that it was good and that we can trust Him. And so have the confidence that Jesus shows us to come into the Father's presence. Follow Him there. He's opened the way for you. And follow Him there and open yourself up to God, trusting God. He's already given you the very best. If He did not withhold His only Son, will He hold back anything else that you really need? You can trust Him. And if we pray like that, then we'll be delivered from the impotence of a prayerless life, and we'll be delivered from the hypocrisy of an outwardly religious life that has no solid core within. Do you want to be real? Do you want God to make you whole and solid? You want Him to heal you from the inside out, then this is where it begins. But it begins by realizing that the only way to come safely into the Father's presence is by way of the Son, whom He has given to reconcile us to Himself. If you've never put Christ on in baptism, having your sins washed away, then we would encourage you this morning to come and confess His name, to begin your walk with Him by saying, I'm letting it all go. I'm turning it all over. I'm all in. I'm committing myself entirely to You. And whatever that means, I don't even know yet, but that's what it's going to be for me. And I want to unite formally and by covenant with God through Jesus Christ.